all intents and purposes, these are kind of 3 to 5 year old seedlings. So this is a very common way. And then we can take all these seedlings and we can compose them together to make a forest. Another way with young plants is to take a pot like this, fill it up with soil, take some Japanese maple seeds, the actual seeds, sprinkle it into the soil, and let them kind of grow naturally. What happens when we do that is we're almost creating a forest by subtraction rather than addition, because we get way more seedlings come up here than we want, and then we delete them to create the thing that we're going to be composing with these plants. That's one way that we can do it. So we can take young material, we can compose something by adding it together. We can literally throw a bunch of seeds in a tray, and we can subtract things to create those, different spacing, different movements. The nice thing about the seeds are you get trees that are very close together. It's hard to take some of these trees, especially older versions of these, if they have established roots, and put them really, really close. So a lot of forests that are made with old material tend to have pretty substantial spacing between the trees. And that's the nice thing about the seed is that you can grow them very close. And they grow with kind of influence of each other as they're chasing the light. So with young plants, we can do forest by addition, by subtraction. You can also take a bunch of old plants. And this is what one of the most famous forest makers in Japan does, is he'll take a tree like this. He might keep it this same size, but he'll trim it for 20 years in a small pot. Make just a little fractal piece of a forest. And then, he might grow all the branches on one side so that he can plug it in pretty nicely to the end composition. And then once this is 20 years old, has a lot of age, has a lot of ramification, he can do that with, not just maybe a small side tree, but a bigger main tree as well. And then you can compose something later on, and then you get something that's almost show ready, kind of right from that point. Those are the 3 ways that we tend to build forests, is either with old material that you assemble, young material that you assemble, or seeds that are grown together. And they have a little bit different strategies. Now, when we're using young material like this, we don't necessarily have the size differences. We do have some size differences here, but not enough to distinguish this as it moves forward. So we're going to have to use growing technique to create the variation in this. If I want something like this to stay small, to not get bigger, so that my bigger trunk can be more of a main tree, then I might defoliate this tree. I might pinch it. I might prune it. I might do all of the bonsai things to this, because when we're pinching, we're pruning, we're defoliating, this isn't thickening up, or it is at a very, very, very slow pace. If I have, let's say I wanted this to be the main tree in the forest, I would pot it up, and I would let this extension grow freely for many years. Maybe let this grow 12 feet tall before I cut it. That's extension, that length is going to build the caliper in the trunk. So we can use growing techniques. If we do have all the trees that are the same size when we start with, or similar size, we can use our growing technique to help create those differences as the bonsai matures. What else do we know about forests?
Do you need to put like similar, I can't think of the word, species? Something that has the same kind of growing conditions.
Yeah, good question. 99% of the time we're going to create forests or root plantings out of the exact same tree species. They don't need to be genetic clones, although sometimes that can be nice, but usually we're doing the same species. I do have several mixed forests in my garden. And I grew up here in the Midwest, so I have sugar maple, red maple, American beech, American hornbeam, kind of mixed together in a forest to look like the woods that I kind of grew up playing in. And mixed forests are a lot more difficult, and they don't have the sustainability factor is a little bit lower. In nature, something's going to win, right? So the trees are going to start to try and outcompete each other. If you've done many kusamono, you might know this. If you throw a bunch of different plants in a kusamono pot or a shitakusa pot, eventually something beats everything else out unless you stay on it and really help control it. So with a mixed forest planting, we have to be really careful to keep everything not fighting each other. That's why you don't see too many of them, because they don't have it's good or an easy as a longevity factor as the same species. The same species will actually fuse together over time. So a lot of the root systems will fuse together, and if the trunks are close enough, they might even fuse together as well. And so many forests that we see that are 30, 50, 70 years old as bonsai, I have a few of these in my collection, the bases have all started to fuse together. So, Bill's doing a great job getting these. We're going to give Bill a round of applause. A lot of deciduous work can be like insect work. My students call them caterpillars, or my volunteers in the garden, because we do a lot of this growth kind of destruction on these plants. But defoliating, you can just, especially if it's young and the branch is somewhat strong, you can just take the leaf and kind of pluck it off, especially on the tridents. Not all species work.
Tridents are weeds.
Tridents are weeds, yeah. Which make good bonsai. They're weeds, but they're also sustainable, meaning, you know, a branch on the interior isn't going to be very quick to die. If you have a birch, for example, birch is also a weed, but it doesn't have the, doesn't have the sustainability of something like a trident. I have a student who calls some of these pioneer species for bonsai, he calls them sport bonsai, because we have to work a lot harder. We have to stay up on them. It's a lot more kind of a mental game and a physical game to really keep up with certain plants. So,
Andrew?
yeah.
So for tridents and maybe Japanese maples, what's your consideration for when you can defoliate coming, after bud break? Is there a period you need to wait?
Yeah, it's a feeling of the leaf. So if we pass this tree around, kind of give that leaf a feel. That leaf is pretty much hardened off. You got it? Pass that around. That leaf feels hardened off. We have good extension. And these are young, vigorous plants. So we're well within the context of being safe for what we're doing. Usually some time has passed too, between when these started leafing out and now. If it's 2 weeks after it starts to leaf out, unless you're in Austin, Texas, and your whole entire spring is 2 weeks. If it's just starting to leaf out, you might want to wait a little bit. So usually 6 to 8 weeks after they break bud is a good kind of time frame, or once you feel the leaf, once it feels a little bit more rigid, less kind of soft and fleshy. Yeah?
Question, maybe you touch on this earlier. What's the process of defoliating?
Yeah, good question. So the purpose of defoliating. Defoliating will create smaller leaves, shorter internodes. Basically, you can think of all broadleaf trees in this way. Let me explain this. So at the base of every single leaf on a broadleaf plant, there is a bud. And if I stripped all of the leaves off of this, the next time this grows, everywhere there was a leaf, a new branch will form. That bud will open and an entire new branch will form. And if you think about it, if we don't repot something like this, let's say we have this in a bonsai pot, if I strip all the leaves off of this, put it in a bonsai pot, I have a set volume of roots. The bonsai pot that we're going to use for this can only generate, X amount of roots, right? And we can only generate more once it fills that pot if we go add more volume. So if I add more and more branches to the same volume of roots that I have, then the growth will get a lot shorter. My internodes especially will get much shorter. My leaves will get smaller. So defoliating will create smaller leaves because all the energy is getting diluted to much more places. The tree has a finite amount of energy. The roots create a finite amount of energy based on the volume that they have. If I'm saying, okay, everywhere where there's a leaf, you're going to grow a new branch, it's double, triple, quadruple the ramification. And that's going to make much smaller leaves, much shorter internodes, and give us nice, tighter, refined growth. So the defoliation really helps with that. That's why trees that can be defoliated, we often do it, because it's a really powerful technique to slow something down. And a lot of these might have been defoliated in the past. These tridents have really nice small leaves. These are a good variety of trident. And in our case today, the defoliation hits the reset button on spring. So these trees now, they've been taken to their silhouettes, and so in the springtime now they're going to regrow with new growth, which means it's a good time for us to go through and repot them. So it's working for us today. It's allowing us to repot these trees more safely. It's also allowing us to maybe prune these and create the branch structure a little bit better. And then moving forward, it's going to help with small leaves, short internodes. Other questions?
So you said it, let me understand, I never heard that when you get 48, you can repot. No,
Yeah.
you repot trotting in springtime.
Yeah, you don't want to repot, in this stage because we have a lot of active growth tips. So if I cut those growth tips back, if I defoliate the tree, it's resetting it to, it's just like right before bud break. That's a very similar kind of time frame. So it's if you miss the repot window, if you have a young vigorous plant, this is kind of a secondary time to repot. A lot of black pine growers in Japan who, they have nothing but black pines, they repot as many black pines as they can during the true repotting season, and then they wait till decandling. Once all those candles have grown, they cut them all off, which kind of resets the spring clock on them, and then they get a second round of repotting.
So if I have established trotting at home, and
I wouldn't do this on something really old. You could, but and it also depends on the amount of root work. We're going to take these roots back pretty far to get them in this spot that we have.
Right.
So it's nicely kind of hitting the reset button for us. If we left all this growth, then maybe with the roots that we're pruning, they'd be out of balance. I'd have way too much foliage and not enough root to support all of that. So this kind of evens things out. Other questions? All right, so we're going to prep some of these now. Basically, we're going to, now anything in a nursery pot, let's just say, we pop one of these out of a nursery pot. Anything in a nursery pot, I don't know where these came from. So I'm always skeptical. You want to start, and this is for nursery stock, this isn't just for small seedlings. You always want to start on the top and work down. Because my nabari on this, or where the roots actually come out of the trunk, could be all the way down here. So if I just took the scissors and cut this across, I could cut off all my nabari and just have it cutting. Oftentimes if you go to the garden center and get something for bonsai, where the soil is not where the roots come off the trunk. So we have to first investigate down. If I don't know where these came from, that's always where I start, is kind of on the top, kind of working down. Here I see my first root coming off the trunk, so that's a good sign that we don't have to dig down too far. Once I start seeing a few more, then I get into a safe spot where then I can just make my cut. But I have to find out where that safe spot is first. These are potted in, looks like good soil, akadama in here, so. And we're gonna get a nice kind of shallow root system. So I'm gonna start by just prepping the roots on all these, get it fairly shallow. We might need to clean some of this up a little bit more to fit some of them closer together, but we're gonna bring everything down to this baseline to get started. Together, we put it in the bottom of the pot, and we were able to wire each one of the 15 trees kind of down through that grid. And it's a really effective way for tying each plant down. The issue is when you go to repot that tree, and you have that huge grid full of roots in the bottom, and it's just a mess, quite frankly. And so it's a really great method for starting a forest, but for repotting a forest, it doesn't. I don't like it. Now you could just drill a bunch of holes in the drainage pot, or in the pot as well, and have a forest that's made that way. But then you're still, when you go to repot this, you have to cut 15 wires out of the pot, try and untangle and extract them. It's a little bit of a mess. Has anyone heard of any other ways besides those? Yeah.
I just did some last week, some Japanese poly, I think it was. And I had really flimsy roots and not many holes on the pot. And so I wound up basically tying each tree to the other and using little pieces of hard tubing in between them. It was kind of a spacer. So I wrap it around and go through the tubing. The next one I had like a grid on top of that. So I think within a year or so I can take that off.
Yeah, that can work as well. And in fact, sometimes what I'll do is I might tie down my main trees, just the 2 or 3 trees. Once those are secure, use little guy wires from the trunks and branches to help secure that. That's a good method. Raffia. That's an interesting idea. Yeah, you could use something kind of temporary, or maybe like an organic twine, and tie something down. That can work. Any others?
I've used rocks.
Use rocks.
I have used rocks to hold each tree in place where I want it until the roots get established. It's worked pretty well
Yeah.
for me a few times.
Okay.
And I've also used where I wrap wire all the way around the outside of the pot
Yeah.
in 2 or 3 places and then wire across it to
Yeah.
the trunks. It doesn't look pretty, but it doesn't have to look pretty in the beginning.
Yeah, yeah. I used to do a lot of those things for us, and then all of that changed when I saw a demo from Mr. Takeyama. Does everyone know Takeyama? He's the deciduous master from the Omiya Bonsai Village. It's, if you go visit Omiya in Japan, he's the one that has all the deciduous trees versus the pines and junipers. And he gave a trident forest demo. It's on YouTube, so everyone go check it out. But he did a trident forest making demo at the World Bonsai Convention, and he made a forest that looked like it could go right into the Kokofu show. It was very good. The reason being is he was growing in high-fired training pots. Let's pretend that's what this is. He was growing a tree like this for 20 years, keeping it really slender, really small. He was growing it directionally, knowing these would be, pieces of the puzzle that would fit in. So all the branches were kind of developed on one side. They were really skinny trees, but they were really old. And so, this was a very long, thought-out kind of forest that he put together. But he didn't use a single piece of wire to tie them down. He used wet soil to hold them in place. I highly recommend everybody go check out that demo, because that's what we're going to do today. And that's how I make most of my forests at home.
How do
When you
spell
say
his
wet
name?
soil,
His name is Takeyama, so Takeyama. And you can see his talk if you Google Forest Planting World Bonsai Convention. This was in 2017. He gave a really, really great demo. So the thing that blew my mind was the wet soil. When we put our water in our soil, it adds, 3-4 times the weight. And so something that's kind of small and moving around the dry soil, you put a bunch of wet soil on it, it really helps lock it down. Now the caveat is you do need a greenhouse or a space that is protected from wind to kind of get these out, maybe a courtyard or something like that. But it's one of the nicest forests to repot, because when you take it out of the pot, there's nothing in there to complicate things. It does require a little bit more significant aftercare, but for me, the benefits pay off. So pretty much every forest that I make, even the ones that I put on stones and everything, have 0 wires in them. They just go into a protected area to really grow and establish into those pots. You come back 6 months later, once they're potted in, and then you try and wiggle it around, and it's pretty well established and grown.
You have to keep them like away from the wind,
What was that?
away from the wind and stuff.
Keep it away from the wind. So if you have a greenhouse, put it in the greenhouse, kind of protected, and that's what I do. Or if you don't have a greenhouse, just in a less windy part of the yard or garden. If you have a courtyard or a corner or something that gets less windy.
So you don't use wire to hold them down, cut down anything?
What was that?
You don't use wire to tie them down?
Not typically. Especially if we're using smaller, younger stuff like this. So now I'm going to kind of grade my trees. So I have these 7 trees here kind of prepared for our pot. We probably don't want to put too many more trees in a small pot like this, at least of this size. You could put, if we had smaller ones, stuff more this size, you could fit in a lot more. But for this size plant, 7 trees I think is what we'll do for today. So we can get these out of the way.
what are some considerations around your pot selection beyond just choosing a nice shallow container that has the horizon line kind of stuff? Is there a lot of thought that you put into, am I developing, is this just a forest that's developing versus a forest that's...
Good question. So we could, let's say, thinking that, knowing that bonsai is not made in the moment, we could build a forest in the whole, volume of this pot, and then one day plant it into a larger pot and give that negative space later. That's one way to do it. Or maybe the person who wins this is downsizing, they want smaller trees. So we could make this fit this pot. That's I think what we'll try and do is make this work well for something actually this size. So there's 2 kind of strategies that you can do. You could, my earlier forests that were not as well built, I kind of just used the entire pot, jammed them in, didn't have a lot of negative space. But now I'm a little bit more conscious to use part of the pot. But you could make a forest out of this, maybe you have a few more trident forests that you make, and then these could be modular things that take out and plug into bigger pots. That's one way to think about it. And oftentimes, for people who make a lot of forests, they have a lot of like flats of trees that are growing, and they're kind of growing in the influence of each other. So all the branches are growing out on one side or just up top or whatnot. And those are great things to be able to pull out and plug into when you do some compositions. Notice what I'm also not doing. I'm not sifting this. So we said we like Akadama because it creates fine roots, right? And we said we like it because as it breaks down, it creates fine roots. So Akadama dust is good. it creates fine roots. This is the whole reason that we like Akadama. So the nice thing about buying a premix like this is you can just scoop right from the bag right into the pot. The other thing is, if you spend hours sifting this stuff, you put it in the pot, you chopstick. What happens when we water it out? A lot of dust gets washed out, right? So maybe this is just because I have 500 trees in my backyard and I don't want to spend a week of my life sifting soil every potting season, but I know Bjorn does this too from Bonsai, just scoops it from the bag into the pot, and I would argue I have very healthy trees. So sift if you want, but it's not something that I do.
Is there any situation where you'd make an exception to that kind of consideration?
If you are sifting non-Akadama, so if you're sifting lava or pumice or something else, pumice dust does not grow fine roots. If you plant trees on 100% pumice, yeah, it doesn't work very well. If it does, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So you do want to get that set. So your soil's sizzling. I feel like I'm on a cooking show. Just have one of these in the oven ready to pull out. So I'm gonna add a few bottles of water. I took a bucket that was pretty light. Now it's got a lot of weight, and that weight is going to hold these trees down really nicely. So I'm going to dump this in the trash just to have a station to work in to protect my water.
That's a good idea.
I built 15 forests this year in the garden. that were made just-
Wiring things are
What was
not
that?
necessary.
Yeah, I mean, the wiring is nice, but when you have so many variables and components, going to repot an initial forest that has 40 wires in it, I don't want to do that. I'm lazy. And you get pretty invasive in the tree, ripping all of those things out.
Mm-hmm.
So this makes for more difficult aftercare, 100%, no question about it. But I would rather, have to live with this in the greenhouse for 4 months than have to spend 4 hours repotting a tangled mess of bamboo and grids and whatnot. So that's my reasoning. Maybe it doesn't work for you, but that's.
No, I've never seen anyone else do this. That's why I think it's interesting.
The best forest master in Japan does this regularly.
Okay.
So we'll take our main trees again, like we said. I'm going to take my tool to help me not use the entire pot, otherwise I'm going to be tempted to keep using the whole pot. And we're going to start to put these together. Now the nice thing that you'll see about the soil is that I did a few forest class this year. So I have some experience designing a forest backwards. But it's a new skill level. If you want to push your skills, try designing a bonsai backwards
Do it in the mirror.
so y'all can see the front. But theoretically, if it looks good from my side, it should also look good from your side. So.
How with wet aoki, how careful are you being with your working of the trees into their positions, and do you not care at all at how much it
Not
breaks
at all.
down? Okay.
So now, this is kind of wobbly, everyone see that? Weight of the soil stays pretty well intact, especially once we get this kind of watered in and situated in. So this is kind of temporary locking these in. Now the nice thing about the wet soil compared to wiring these in is it still allows for us room to play. So let's say I make this whole thing, I'm like, what did I do? That looks terrible.
Yeah.
I can then take this out, pop it up, move it over, and kind of scoop some soil out, and it allows us flexibility to play around. So our second tree, notice these have a little bit of a lean. Maybe I want to accentuate that lean a little bit. Flare these out a little bit more. Yeah, that's nice.
In the times where I've tried to make forests without doing much reinforcing of the trees, often struggle with having environmental conditions send the trees, you know, into more slant than I was hoping for. When you're dealing with, you know, with these size trees, it feels like the AOP can do its job even with the trees that you're trying to put on an angle. But is there a certain point at which size of tree or the slant that you want in that is gonna force you to change your technique with this?
Yeah, and let's say we get this exactly how we like when we're done, and we don't have full structural stability. That's where, you know, putting some guy wires on or clips to help hold these together. Maybe you win this and you don't have a greenhouse or a sheltered area in your yard. And you live in Nebraska and you get tornadoes every other week. Then what you could do is actually take a wire and just kind of put it around the entire yurt. That can help stabilize it. So we can do a lot of temporary, short-term, ugly stuff with wires on top to help kind of lock things up. Okay. So notice here, I'll put this up for everybody. So I have a small space here and a big space here. That was deliberate. Try and break it up. Because this space was small, I have so few trees to work with. So small here, big space here. Everybody see that? Trying to build in that variety. This is like Morse code. We need dots and dashes that are kind of random configuration. The other nice thing about the wet soil is it keeps the roots nice and hydrated. So if we're playing around, you know, for longer and the roots are staying exposed, it kind of helps lock things in. So we get our kind of main trees kind of locked in, and then that allows us to room to kind of play with everything else. Sometimes we might see something like a branch that was a little bit too strong or angular, so I can turn that back to work a little better. Using a small tree in the back to give us some depth. Finishing up this first cell with potted trees. You all know from your home clubs how difficult it is to put on a show or a convention. So if you see any of the St. Louis people, tell them thank you for their work, because there's a lot of good volunteers who are making all this fun stuff happen for us. So really appreciate them doing that. All right, see this small little tree we can put. Again, this is the nice thing about the small soil is we can have a little bit more flex. Maybe I'm not liking that, so we're going to put a few of these on the outside. Forests are great for beginners too. So if you're a beginner yourself, or if you teach a lot of beginners, you know, this is something that a lot of people respond to, and you can even hook people really well. If everyone knows that they have a club show, the forest and the club show is going to hook the general public more than the crazy trees we tend to like. So they're not just fun. You can do a lot of these workshops, but they're really affordable. You know, the cost for this, you know, this is a cheap pot. These are, you know, $5, $10 trees, or you can even just go collect seedlings off the sidewalk that work well for this. But we have a lot of fun with these things. That's a lot of deciduous technique, is doing a simple thing, making a plan, and executing it over a long time period. It's kind of like a chess game where we're thinking a few moves ahead. All right, any other questions? Yeah.
What kind of height are you thinking? Or to keep it for-
If it's gonna stay in a pot about this size, then not too much taller. If we go in a pot 20% taller, it can get a little bit taller. But for this size pot, we're pretty close. We will let things run to thicken them up, but then we'll cut them back really short to keep it about this height. Good question.
Another question.
Yeah.
In case this went like after the auction back to Minnesota or
Uh-huh.
California or
Yeah, yeah.
wherever, would the club like shrink wrap the soil in place so it doesn't vibrate all apart on the ride?
For the vehicle?
Yeah.
You know, probably what we could do is, it would look very ugly, but I'd be happy to help anyone. We could take wire and we could kind of, one way to do it is, kind of lock a bunch of these together so that if kind of one moves, they all kind of help support and lock them in. So that's something that I would do. For sure.
Is there any sort of pause time on when you can start putting fertilizer in it, or you go right away?
If it's a very mild fertilizer, we can do it tomorrow. So if it's full strength Miracle-Gro, wait a month or two.
Okay.
But I don't recommend using that. Yeah.
I might have missed the pot selection part of this. Do you ever use rectangular pots?
Yeah,
Or
rectangles are
sort of
fine as long as they're long, shallow, and skinny.
Long, shallow, and skinny.
Do you ever defoliate the main trees or you just let it grow?
You might, once you want to start creating nice fine branching on them. So once the trunks are the appropriate thickness, then we move into branch building stage, and then to get nice fine branches, the defoliation on tridents are making. So maybe we let these run freely for a year or two to thicken up, and then we cut them back. Maybe they're not thick enough by that time, so we let them run for another year or two freely to thicken up. We cut them back. Then they're nice and thick. Then we can start defoliating them like the rest to start building branches. Generally, if we need to grow a trunk, we let it run. If we need to build branches or twigs, then we do a lot of pinching, defoliating, pruning, all of those things. We can only do 3 things in bonsai. People like to make bonsai really complicated, but we can only do 3 things. Number 1 is shape growth. So I can take something like this and put a wire on it and bend it and shape it. Number 2 is I can remove growth. I can say, oh, that branch isn't really, it's longer than I need, it's kind of straight, ugly, it doesn't have taper, cut it off. Number 3 is I can do nothing. And oftentimes doing nothing is the most important thing because we don't get any thickening if we do nothing. You do get micro thickening over time. So in 30 years, if we just pinch this completely, the trunks would grow just a little tiny bit larger in size. But if we let this grow and we pinch this one, in 5 years, this is going to be 3 times the size. This is going to be roughly the same size. So, yeah, those are really the only 3 things in bonsai. Those are our 3 choices. If we need something to get thicker, if we need development, we let it run. We don't prune the growth, we don't pinch it, we don't do all the bonsai things that you hear about to do. If we want to start building twigs and fine ramification, that's when we start doing a lot of pinching. Yeah?
Henry, can you talk about, one of your early forests you built, I know you took it apart and expanded it.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us a little bit about the...
Yeah, let's say we did a crap job on this, you get it 20 years later and you hate the placement that we did today. Fast forward 20 years. So you could take a forest that's not very well put together and you can try and separate it. The older it is, the harder it's going to be to separate a lot of those chunks, and the more risk that's going to be on the individual trees to do that. But I have done that several times. Oftentimes actually you can win nice things in either auctions or club sales or whatnot. Because you might find old forests, maybe they're not put together with any sort of intention or design, but the trees themselves are old and have nice age. Those are some of my favorite things to buy at club auctions, because then I'll just buy it, try and reassemble it. Sometimes better than reassemble it all individually is take a pod out and try and separate different pods and rearrange the pods to look good. That's another way to do it. But yeah, the older it is, the more tricky it is to reconstruct. Oftentimes, though, maybe what you could do is, and if you win this forest, what you could do is next time it gets repotted, you could add more trees. So you get a bunch of smaller trees, like real tiny thin stuff the size of this wire, just 1-year-old seedlings. And you can add a bunch of these to help, add more design to this one. Yeah, and we don't have any that are super small, but if we just kind of played around for a quick second, cut a few pieces of these wires. Adding, a few more kind of small trees, here, especially in the back, would help kind of maybe pull your eye through and kind of help maybe kind of situate this a little more. So, just an idea. Playing with the wires or even chopsticks. If you have a forest, that's something you can do to start thinking about where to place things. Yeah.
Understory plants, like.
Typically, we don't put anything else, especially if the forest is small. If you have a really large jumbo forest, then using small plants can work for scale. Salaginella is one of the best. Young corrected me yesterday. It's not a fern, but it looks like a fern. It gets a really nice orange color. You see that used a lot in Japan.
Salaginella?
Salaginella. Talk to Shannon at Kusa Farm. He has some. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to move on to my